I've kept this secret for 9 years. I kept it because he asked me to. I kept it because I watched what it cost him, and I believed, as men who love their friends will believe almost anything, that silence was the kindest shape of loyalty. I'm not sure now that I was right, but I will tell you what I saw from the beginning because I was the only one there for all of it, and because the truth of a man's love is not only in the moment he confesses it. It is in every quiet year before he does. My name is Edmund Calloway. I am the 4th son of a Shropshire baronet. I have no fortune and no great title, and I have been the closest friend of the Duke of Halverton since we were 19 years old, and sharing a cold study at the same college in Oxford, each of us too proud to admit that the fire had gone out. He is James Ashford, the 7th Duke of Halverton, and he is the man this story is about, though he would refuse that description, as he refuses most things that require him to place himself at the center of any room. He stood at the edges of rooms his whole life. That was the point. That was, I think, how it began. The woman's name was Miss Cecily Morrow, the daughter of a Mr. Gerald Morrow, who had once been a man of modest substance, a good name, a small estate in Wiltshire, a reputation for warmth if not for wisdom, and who had, in the winter of 18 years ago, made a series of decisions in the matter of debt that were so catastrophically mistaken that within 3 years the estate was gone. The name was a cause for sympathetic murmurs, and Cecily Morrow was 19 years old with 2 younger brothers. A father whose health had broken along with his finances, and precisely no prospects that society would recognize as such. I knew of her before James did. My sister had been at school with her, and had liked her well, had described her as the sort of girl who could make a cold room feel warm simply by walking into it. That is the kind of observation women make that men are slow to understand, and I confess I filed it away without much thought. James met her at a Wiltshire dinner party in early autumn. We were both visiting mutual acquaintances, and the dinner was the sort of strained, overlit affair that provincial society produces when it is trying very hard. Too many candles, soup that had been kept warm too long, and a conversational atmosphere of determined cheerfulness over which the hostess presided with the bright, exhausted energy of a woman who has been cheerful by effort for many years. The Morrows were present because they were neighbors and because, I suspected, the hostess had a kind heart and knew that Cecily Morrow did not get out very often. She was seated at the far end of the table from James. I was beside him, and I saw the moment he noticed her, though I did not understand it then for what it was. She was laughing at something the gentleman beside her had said, a quiet laugh, private and genuine, not performed for the room, and she was helping her younger brother, who must have been 15 at the time, cut his meat without making the assistants visible, with the practiced invisibility of someone who has learned to do 100 caring things in such a way that the person being cared for does not feel diminished by it. James went still. Not dramatically. James rarely did anything dramatically. He simply went very still, the way a man does when something has caught in him that he does not yet have a name for. He did not speak to her that evening. She sat too far away, and he was not a man who crossed rooms easily. He stood too high in everything for rooms to feel simple, too titled, too feared, too freshly returned from the war in which he had served 3 difficult years and come back quieter and more close than I had known him before. Society watched him with the combination of admiration and wariness that powerful men who do not perform their power tend to produce. Women were presented to him with the anxious hopefulness of families who understood the value of a dukedom, and he met every presentation with a courtesy so scrupulous and so distant that it might as well have been a closed door. He watched her at that dinner for 2 hours. I know because I watched him watching her, and I counted without meaning to. He asked about her on the drive home, casually, the tone men use when they are trying not to sound as though they are asking a question that matters. I told him what I knew, the father's ruin, the brothers to raise, the way my sister had described her. He listened without commenting, which was James's way of listening when something had touched him enough that words felt insufficient. The carriage moved through the dark lanes, and he looked out the window at nothing in particular, and I could hear the horses and the creak of the wheels and James not saying anything in a way that said a great deal. 3 weeks later I discovered, entirely by accident, that he had made a quiet inquiry through his solicitor about the state of the Morrow family's debts. Not ostentatiously, not in the way a man performs charity so that others may observe his virtue. He had asked a specific question about the size of the outstanding principal and the identity of the primary creditor, and he had done it through a man 3 removes from anyone who might connect the inquiry to him. I confronted him about it that evening. He was reading by the fire in the library of the house we were both staying in, and he did not look up immediately when I said his name. "I know what you're going to say," he said. "Then you know I'm right." "I have not done anything yet." He turned a page that I was fairly certain he had not read. "I was curious about the situation." "You were curious," I said, "about a specific young woman's family's financial situation." "I was curious," he said very quietly, "about whether anyone was going to do something about it." That was the first time I understood that this was not going to be a passing observation. He paid the primary debt 6 weeks later, anonymously, through the solicitor, structured in such a way that the creditor received what was owed, and the Morrow family received a notice that the debt had been discharged by an unnamed party who wished no acknowledgement. The letter cited the discretion of the benefactor as the reason for the anonymity, and asked only that the family accept the relief in the spirit in which it was offered. I asked him why he had not simply introduced himself. He set down his glass and looked at the fire for a long time before answering. "She would feel she owed me something," he said. "I do not want her to feel she owes me anything." "You could court her," I said. "If you intend to go on funding her family indefinitely, it might be more efficient to." "Edmund," he said my name with the particular quiet weight he used when he was asking me to stop without wishing to be rude about it. "She is rebuilding her life. She is holding her family together. She does not need a duke appearing at her door with intentions. She needs the debt cleared, and her father's creditors off her back so she can breathe. And after she can breathe." He did not answer, which was, with James, an answer. I thought about that non-answer a good deal in the weeks that followed. There was something in it that was both admirable and, if I am honest, faintly maddening. He was a man of great principle and great capacity, and he had turned all of that capacity toward the anonymous care of a woman he had seen once across a dinner table. It was not nothing. It was, by any reasonable measure, a great deal. But it was also a choice that asked very little of him in the particular way that mattered, which was the way of being seen, and being known, and taking the risk that a person might look at you fully and find something wanting. That risk he had declined. He had found a form of devotion that did not require him to be vulnerable, and having found it, he had settled into it with the thoroughness of a man who is relieved to have located a solution that does not require him to be afraid. I said none of this at the time. There would have been no point. James, when he had decided something, was not a man who reconsidered easily, and he had decided, in the months since the Wiltshire dinner, that this was the shape his feeling would take. The roses came the following spring, not the first spring. The first spring he only paid the debt and kept his distance. The roses began the spring after, when I came back from a visit to my family, and found, in his correspondence, evidence of a standing arrangement with a florist in Bath, who sent a small bunch of deep red roses to the Morrow household every month, the card bearing only the printed words, "From a friend who wishes you well." I said nothing about the roses for a long time. What was there to say? I watched him, and I watched the arrangement continue, and I tried to understand a man who could love someone, for I was certain by then that love was what it was, with such absolute refusal to place himself in the equation. There was, I came to think, a kind of discipline in it that was almost monastic, the devotion stripped of all selfishness, all the parts of love that reach back toward the lover and ask to be seen. Most love contains an enormous amount of wanting. His contained, as far as I could tell, almost none, which should have made it easier to bear and did not. I asked him once, perhaps a year in, whether he had seen her since the dinner in Wiltshire. Twice, he said. At public occasions she did not see me. You are not easy to miss. I stood behind people, he said, with such complete seriousness that I did not know whether to laugh or to be moved by it. I was, in the end, both. He had, he told me, seen her at a concert in Bath, where she had been sitting in the third row of the balcony with her younger brother, and he had been in the back of the stalls below. She had been wearing a blue gown, and she had leaned toward her brother at one point to whisper something during a pause in the music, and her brother had suppressed a laugh very badly. James had told me this detail with such precision that I understood he had replayed it a number of times in the interval since. The second occasion had been a county assembly, where she had danced twice and he had not, and where he had spent the better part of the evening near the far window watching the room with an expression that probably struck any observer as the usual cold detachment of the Halverton dukedom, and was, I knew, something else entirely. Those are the years I find hardest to describe, because they were years of almost nothing, years of watching a man sustain a devotion in near-perfect silence that most people require constant acknowledgment to maintain. The debt was paid, and then there were smaller debts, a medical bill for the father, a school fee for one of the brothers that had come due at an inconvenient moment, once a winter heating cost that had risen beyond what the household could manage. Each time the same arrangement, the solicitor, the anonymous payment, the note that asked for nothing, and each month the roses. I know the roses reached her because my sister told me, without understanding the significance of what she was telling me. My sister had called on the morrows and mentioned afterward that Cecily always had fresh roses on the table in the parlor, and had laughed when my sister admired them, and said she had a mysterious benefactor whose identity she had never been able to discover. She seems to think, my sister said, that it is some elderly relation she has never met, or perhaps a friend of her father's who has not the courage to reveal himself. She has constructed quite a charming imaginary picture of him. She calls him, in private, the kind gentleman, and she says that she prays for him every night, whoever he is, because she does not know how her family would have managed otherwise. I repeated this to James that evening. He was standing at the window of my house in London, looking out at the street below, and when I finished speaking, he was quiet for so long that I wondered if he had heard me. I want to be precise about what his face did in the silence, because I watched it carefully, and I do not want to lose the detail. There was first a stillness, the ordinary stillness of James receiving information, and then beneath it something else, something that moved through him the way a wind moves through a stand of very still trees, briefly, visibly, and then gone. He had not known she prayed for him. He had not known she had given him a name and a face in her imagination. He had thought, I understood this in that moment with sudden clarity, that the anonymity was mutual, that he was invisible to her in the same way he was invisible to everyone else, a blank generosity, a force without a shape. He had not considered that she would have constructed a shape for him out of her own warmth and imagination, would have built him a personality and a history, and a set of imagined qualities, and attached her nightly prayers to them. I watched him understand that the woman he was watching at a careful distance was watching back, not him specifically, because she did not know it was him, but the idea of him, which she had made kind and elderly and full of quiet goodness. He was the kind elderly gentleman. He had become, in her interior life, a person. I thought, watching his face, that this might be the thing that undid the plan, that the reality of being imagined might make the distance untenable. But I was wrong. What it did, instead, was give him a reason to maintain it. She had a version of him that was entirely good. He did not want to replace it with a version that was complicated. Then he said, very quietly, "Good. I would rather she imagine a kind, elderly gentleman than feel any obligation to me." "James," I said, "it has been 4 years. I am aware of how long it has been. You cannot simply continue to." "Edmund," the same quiet wait, "please." I stopped, because there was something in his face, turned away from me toward the window, that I had no word for then and have a better word for now. It was grief, I think, not for what he had lost, but for what he was choosing not to reach for, and the reasons he had for choosing it. He did not believe he was good enough for her. That is the thing I could not make him see in all those years. Not because he doubted his rank or his wealth, those he understood perfectly well to be advantages, but because he believed that the man he had come back from the war as closed in the way ice is closed, heavy in the way iron is heavy, given to silences that could last days and an emotional guardedness that had driven away every attempt at friendship or softness except mine, was not a man who should be allowed to affect the life of someone as quietly alive as Cecily Morrow. He thought he would damage her. He was wrong, but I could not make him see it. So the years continued. 5, 6, 7. The father died peacefully, which was a mercy, in the spring of the 6th year, and the roses continued even then. He told me later that he had considered stopping them at the father's death, thinking that the worst of the crisis was past, and she was managing, and perhaps the gesture had become more presumptuous than kind. Then he thought about the table in the parlor, and the pressed roses my sister had mentioned, and the prayers for the kind elderly gentleman, and he instructed the florist to continue. The younger brothers grew up. The elder one found a modest position in a solicitor's firm. The younger was finishing his studies. Cecily Morrow became, slowly, less the daughter of a ruined man and more simply herself, a woman in her mid-20s whom society knew as quiet and capable and possessed of an inexplicable contentment that her circumstances did not entirely account for. I believe the roses contributed to that contentment, though she did not know it. There is something sustaining about being thought of, even when you cannot see the face of the person thinking. She did not know his face, but she knew that every month, without fail, someone thought of her enough to send her something beautiful. That is not a small thing to know. James, for his part, watched from the edges of rooms when they were in the same city, which happened perhaps twice a year. He had developed what I can only describe as an expertise in being in her vicinity without being noticed, which was a remarkable achievement for a man of 6 feet 2 inches who was a duke, and whom most rooms reorganized themselves around upon his entrance. He watched her dance. He watched her talk. He watched her help her younger brother with his collar in a doorway at a concert, with that same practiced invisible tenderness, and I saw his hands tighten slightly at his sides and then deliberately loosen. I began to understand in the 7th year that the anonymity had become a kind of shelter for him as much as a gift to her. As long as he was the unknown benefactor, he could not be refused. There is safety in being invisible, a terrible, airless safety, the safety of a man who has decided the risk is too great and has built the most elaborate possible justification for not taking it. He had convinced himself that his love was purer in anonymity, that it asked less, that it was more genuinely good because it expected nothing back. There was truth in that. But there was also, if I am being honest, a great deal of fear dressed up as nobility. On the night of the 7th year, after a concert in Bath at which we had both been present, and at which she had sat 3 rows ahead of us and he had not moved his eyes from the back of her head for 2 hours, I said to him on the walk home, "James, you are not being noble. You are being a coward." He stopped walking. I stopped too, and we stood on a quiet street in the lamplight, and I watched him absorb that. "I know," he said. It was the first time he had said it. "Then do something." He looked at the street ahead of us. His jaw was set in the way it's set when he was fighting himself. "What if she does not?" "What if she does?" I said. "You have spent 7 years ensuring that she never has the chance to answer that question. That is not generosity, James. That is self-protection dressed as generosity. He was very quiet for a long time. Around us, the street went on being quiet, a carriage at the far end, a lamp guttering in the wind, the sounds of Bath settling into its evening, and he stood in it like a man who is attempting something very difficult without making it look like effort. "Next spring," he said finally. "You have said next spring before." "Next spring," he said again, with a weight in it that was different from before. "I mean it." He meant it. I believe he meant it. I believe that if the winter had passed differently, the spring would have been the moment, some carefully arranged introduction, some occasion at which they could speak without the weight of 9 years between them, something that gave them a beginning that did not require explaining the middle. But winter brought instead an invitation to the annual gathering at Caldervane, which was Lord Ashmore's great estate in the north of Wiltshire, and which was the preeminent social occasion of the county's winter season. Caldervane's great ballroom held 300 without crowding, and Ashmore invited everyone, which meant this year that the guest list included Cecily Morrow, who had become friendly with Ashmore's daughter-in-law, and it included James, and it included me. I watched him read the invitation. I watched him decide. "Go," I said. "I know," he said. We arrived at Caldervane on a Thursday evening, 2 days before the ball. The approach to the house was through an avenue of limes, bare in the winter, and the house itself sat at the end of it with the confident grandeur of something that has been standing in that particular spot for long enough to consider itself part of the landscape rather than merely placed upon it. 3 stories of pale stone, windows lit in the early dusk, smoke from a dozen chimneys. I had been to Caldervane before. James had not, and I watched him take it in through the carriage window with the expression of a man noting the exits and entrances of a room he is about to occupy. James was composed in the way he was always composed, the surface of him entirely still and the inside of him, I knew by then, a good deal less so. I had known him long enough to read the tells, the slight set of the jaw, the pause before he spoke when normally he did not pause, the way his hands were always very deliberate and quiet when he was working very hard to seem unaffected. The house was full. Ashmore was a generous host, and his house was a warm one, fires in every room, the smell of pine and wax, the particular noise of a large country estate in the days before a ball, when everyone is arriving and reorganizing, and the servants are running very fast in all directions with an appearance of perfect calm. James and I were given rooms in the east wing, and that first evening there was a dinner at which I counted 40 guests and spent most of my time watching the door. She arrived late with her younger brother, who had come down from his studies for the occasion. She wore a gown of deep green, not new, but well cared for, and it suited her. She was 28 years old, and she was, I am not the most poetic man, but I will say this. She was the kind of woman who becomes more herself as she gets older, not less. The quality my sister had described, the ability to make a cold room feel warm, had not diminished. It had become something more exact, more deliberate, more fully her. She moved through the dinner with the ease of someone who has learned that the world is not always kind, and has decided not to hold it against the world. James, across the table, said nothing for approximately 45 minutes. I watched him watching her and felt something between pity and satisfaction. He ate precisely 3 things from the several courses placed before him, and I do not believe he tasted any of them. After dinner, when the company had dispersed into the drawing rooms, I found him standing in the entrance hall, entirely alone, staring at nothing in particular. "Well," I said. "Don't," he said. "I haven't said anything." "You were about to." "You should speak to her tonight," I said. "Not at the ball, that's too public, too much weight. Tonight in the drawing room while people are milling about. It's simple, you're both guests, you introduce yourself." "She knows who I am," he said. "Everyone in the county knows who I am." "She doesn't know you," I said. "That's the point, go and let her know you." He went into the drawing room. I followed at a discreet distance and positioned myself near the fire with a glass of port, from which vantage point I had an excellent view of the whole room. I watched James cross it slowly, with that characteristic deliberateness, toward the corner where Cecily Morrow was talking to Ashmore's daughter-in-law. He stopped 2 feet away, waited for a natural pause, and when she turned, he bowed slightly and said something. I could not hear it from across the room, but I saw her expression. A moment of recognition, his title, his face, and then something that settled into a quite genuine smile, not the performed warmth of social obligation, but something that arrived in her eyes a half-second before it reached her mouth. They talked for perhaps 20 minutes. I watched without being able to hear a word. I watched his face do something I had not seen it do in 9 years, something that was not quite ease, because James was never quite ease, but was the closest approximation of it I had witnessed in him since before the war. He was almost still listening to her. The jaw was not set. The hands were at his sides without being deliberate about it. At one point she said something that made him laugh, a brief, surprised laugh, the laugh of a man who had forgotten that he could be surprised into laughter. I saw it from across the room, and I had to look away for a moment, because there was something in it that felt too private to observe. When they parted, he came back to me and I waited. He started and stopped. I know, I said. She talked about her brother's studies, he said. She talked about a book she had been reading about the history of Wiltshire. She talked about the rose garden at Caldervane and whether the particular variety Ashmore grew was frost-resistant. He paused. She did not talk about herself. She talked about everything around her, and all of it was interesting. James, I said. I know, he said. And he did know. He knew what he had been doing for 9 years, and he knew what it had cost him, and he knew that the woman he had been watching at a careful distance for 9 years was, in conversation, exactly what she had looked like from across every room, someone who made the cold places warmer. He knew all of it. I watched him know it, standing by my fire with his glass of port, and I thought, tomorrow. It will be tomorrow at the ball, and it will be right. The ball was on the Saturday evening. Caldervane's great ballroom was everything Ashmore's reputation promised. 300 candles in the chandeliers, the floors polished to a mirror, the company in their best and most elaborate, the musicians in the gallery, the whole thing arranged with the comfortable grandeur of a house that has been hosting great occasions for 200 years and has learned not to make a fuss about it. I arrived early and found my preferred position near the east wall, from which I could observe the room without being too visible myself. James arrived 20 minutes into the first set. He did not dance. He almost never danced at public occasions. It drew too much attention, and he did not like the attention. He stood near the edge of the room and watched, and I found him after a few minutes and stood beside him. Cecily Morrow arrived perhaps half an hour in, with her brother and a small group of the younger guests. She was wearing a gown of ivory this time again, not new, but she wore it well, with a kind of unconscious dignity that had nothing to do with wealth and everything to do with character. She moved into the room without fanfare, said something to her brother that made him laugh, and then was claimed almost immediately by Ashmore's daughter-in-law, who seemed genuinely pleased to see her. She danced 2 sets. She was a good dancer, not showy, but certain, with the quiet precision of someone who has done a thing often enough to do it without thinking. I noticed 2 gentlemen attempting to secure her hand for the 3rd set. She declined both with a warmth that left neither of them feeling dismissed, which is a skill not everyone has and which told me, watching, something about the texture of her daily life, the constant management of other people's feelings with a deftness so habitual she probably did not notice it anymore. James noticed. I watched him notice. It was during the pause between the 2nd and 3rd sets that it happened, the thing that broke 9 years open in a single evening and led to everything that followed. Ashmore, who was the kind of host who liked to create moments of connection among his guests, had arranged a brief entertainment before the supper, a few words from the company's most distinguished members, a small toast, that sort of thing. He was a cheerful, well-meaning man, and he had the benign conviction that a party was improved by speeches. Most of the room tolerated this with the patient good nature of people who know it will be brief. As part of this interlude, Ashmore mentioned, entirely innocently, entirely without understanding what he was setting in motion, that among his guests was the remarkable Miss Morrow, whose family has been so sustained, I am told, by the generosity of a mysterious friend that her brothers have been given every advantage, and who has herself weathered some very difficult years with extraordinary grace. He said it with genuine admiration, and the room turned toward her with the warm collective murmur of a company that found the idea of mysterious benefactors charming. And Cecily Morrow, composed, gracious, with the dignity she always had, said a few words. Quiet, simple words not performed. She said that she did not know who her benefactor was, and that she had spent 9 years wondering, and that she had decided it must be someone of very great kindness and very little wish for acknowledgement, which she thought was the finest combination of qualities a person could have. She said she thought of him, because she had always imagined a him, some kind and older gentleman, as the sort of man who did not need the world to know he was good in order to remain so. And she said that she prayed for him, whoever he was, and hoped that wherever he was, he knew that what he had done had made it possible for her family to survive, and more than survive. She paused, and a small thing crossed her face that was not quite composed, a brightness in her eyes that she managed, with the practiced control of someone who has learned to manage such things in public, and said that she was grateful beyond any words she had. The room was very warm. Several women were visibly moved. It was exactly the kind of speech that a Caldervane ball was designed to produce and contain. I was not looking at the room. I was looking at James. He was standing 3 people deep from the nearest edge of the crowd, and no one was paying him the slightest attention, and he was not composed. Every year of careful composure, 9 years of stillness and silence and deliberate distance, was entirely absent from his face. What was there instead was something I had never seen on him before, something naked and stricken, and so wholly private that I felt I should look away. But I did not look away, because I understood that I was watching a man decide something. He did not do it immediately. He stood there through the end of her words and through the warm applause of the company, and through the moment when Ashmore laughed and said that the mysterious benefactor ought to reveal himself, and whoever he was, he had Ashmore's personal admiration. James stood through all of that entirely still, and I could not read the calculation behind his eyes, only its intensity, which was very great. Then he moved, quietly, as he always did everything. He stepped forward through the cluster of people near him, not quickly, not with any appearance of urgency, but with the absolute certainty of a man who has finished arguing with himself and has arrived at the other side of the argument. The crowd shifted for him without his having to ask, as it always did, and he came to stand at the edge of the cleared floor space near where Ashmore was still standing, and the nearest guests, recognizing him, made the small instinctive space that people always made around him in rooms. Ashmore saw him and looked mildly surprised. James was not, as I have said, a man who came forward in rooms. James said, "Ashmore, if you will allow it." Ashmore, to his credit, simply nodded. James turned to face the room. He was entirely calm now, the way he was calm when he had made a decision and was past the reaching of doubt, and he looked at Cecily Morrow, who was still standing near the center of the cleared floor with a faint, wondering expression, clearly unsure what was happening. He said, "Miss Morrow." The room went quiet in the way rooms do when a duke addresses someone directly at a public occasion, not rudely, but with the focused attentiveness of 300 people who have suddenly understood that something is happening that is not on the program. She met his eyes. She did not understand yet. I watched her face, composed, a little questioning, a slight wondering furrow at the brow. He said, The kind elderly gentleman you have been imagining is not elderly. He is 37 years old. He is not a family friend of your father's. He has no connection to your family at all, except a dinner party in Wiltshire 9 years ago, at which he sat at the wrong end of the table and could not hear a word you said, and has spent 9 years regretting it. The room did not breathe. Cecily Morrow stared at him. I watched the comprehension arrive in her face slowly, in stages, like light moving across a room. The debt, the roses, every year, the kind gentleman she had prayed for, whose imaginary face she had constructed from nothing but kindness. I watched her understand that the face was not imaginary, and that she had spoken to it at dinner 2 evenings ago, and that it had laughed when she said something about the frost-resistant roses. Her hand went to her mouth briefly, and then she lowered it with a deliberateness that was entirely characteristic of her. The same deliberateness with which she had always done the 100 private things she did not want to make visible. But her eyes were very bright. James said, "I owe you an explanation, and I owe you an apology for the years I chose silence over honesty. I believed," he paused, the pause of a man choosing words with care in a public room, knowing that what he says will be heard and repeated and will matter. "I believed that what I felt for you was not something you had asked for or had reason to welcome, and that placing it before you uninvited would be an imposition. I thought the better course was to do what I could do without asking anything in return." He paused again. "I was wrong," he said, "or at least I was wrong to continue in silence as long as I did. There is a generosity in telling the truth that I withheld from you for 9 years, and I am sorry for it." The room was so silent I could hear the candles. Cecily Morrow said, in a voice that was perfectly steady in a way that I think took considerable effort, "You sent the roses." "Every month," he said, "since the spring after we met." She said very quietly, "I have them, all of them, the pressed ones. I pressed one from every month." Something moved across his face at that, something brief and unguarded and wholly human. He looked at her, and I think in that moment the 9 years contracted, all the watching from the back of rooms, all the standing behind people, all the monthly arrangements with the florist in Bath, contracted into this one room, this one woman, this single fact. She had pressed every rose. "Miss Morrow," he said, "I would very much like, if you are willing, to have the conversation we should have had 9 years ago. Not here," a slight gesture indicating the 300 silent people surrounding them, "though I regret that I seem to have made a public occasion of a private matter, but whenever you are comfortable, if you are willing." She was quiet for a moment that felt much longer than it was. The entire room held itself in suspension. I am fairly certain that Ashmore beside me was not breathing. Then she said, "I have been imagining a kind elderly gentleman for 9 years, Your Grace. I confess I am going to need a little time to revise the picture." And the room laughed, warmly, genuinely, with the laughter of 300 people who had just witnessed something they had not expected and found themselves, despite themselves, delighted by it. And he smiled. James Ashford, the Duke of Halverton, the coldest man in 3 counties, smiled, and it changed his face in a way I had never quite seen before, as though the coldness had not been coldness at all, but only the shape a man's face makes when it has been a long time since it had a reason. The supper interlude followed. I found myself stationed near the door to the terrace, allowing the room to do what it does after a moment of public revelation, murmur and speculate and reposition itself, and I was content to let it. I had my port, and I had the satisfaction of a man who has waited a long time for something to come right. James found me there an hour later. He looked the way a man looks after he has jumped from a great height and discovered that the ground was closer than he feared. "Well," I said. "That was not how I planned it," he said. "You didn't plan it at all. You decided on the spot." "I decided on the spot," he agreed. "When she described the kind elderly gentleman, I could not—" he stopped. "I could not stand there and listen to her pray for a fiction. Not any more." Where is she now? In the supper room with her brother. I have asked Ashmore if I might speak with her in the library after supper, if she consents. And does she consent? Ashmore says she does. He was quiet for a moment. Edmund, what do I say to her? I looked at him. 9 years. The solicitor and the anonymous payments and the roses and the standing behind people at concerts. All of it. The truth, I said. Everything you just said in there and everything you couldn't say in front of 300 people. The entire truth. She may find it. James, I said it with the same quiet weight he used on me when he wanted me to stop. She pressed the roses. He went very still. She kept everyone, I said. She pressed them, 9 years of them. That is not the behavior of a woman who considers herself simply the recipient of an anonymous charity. He did not say anything, but I watched something settle in him, some final piece of resistance, some last argument he had been keeping in reserve and dissolve. The library at Caldervane was a long room lined floor to ceiling on 3 walls with books, with tall windows along the 4th wall overlooking the winter garden, and a fire at the far end burning low and gold. I did not go in, of course. I stationed myself in the corridor with a candle and a book I made no attempt to read, and spent a very satisfactory hour contemplating the excellent quality of Ashmore's wallpaper. I do not know everything that was said in that room. James told me some of it afterward, and some of it I did not ask about, because there are parts of a man's deepest honesty that belong to him and the person he offered it to. He told her about the dinner in Wiltshire. He told her that he had asked about her family through his solicitor, and that the state of what he found had made him want to help before he had any clearer feeling than that, simply the instinct that something unfair was happening, and that he had the means to address it. He told her that the clearer feeling had arrived later and had not gone away. He told her about the roses. He told her about standing behind people at concerts. She apparently found that particular detail very affecting, because she laughed at it. And then, he told me this with some difficulty, apologized for laughing, because she could see that it was not, in its way, a funny thing. He told her that he had found it slightly funny himself in retrospect, and that she need not apologize, and that the concert in Bath at which she had whispered something to her brother and her brother had suppressed a laugh very badly was the one he remembered best. She was quiet at that, he said, for a moment. Then she asked which concert it had been. He described the program. She remembered the evening, the piece her brother had whispered about, the particular difficulty of suppressing a laugh during a delicate passage in the strings. She had not known he was there. She had not known someone was watching her at all, much less watching with the attention James brought to the exercise. She sat with that for a little while, he said, and he let her sit with it, which cost him something, because the silences in that library after all the silence he had already kept were of a very different quality. Then she said, quietly, "It is a strange thing to discover that you have been known from a distance. I am not certain whether it is more moving or more unnerving." He had told her it was probably both, and that he was sorry for the unnerving portion, and that he understood if she needed time to determine how she felt about the whole of it. She said that she had prayed for 9 years for a fiction, and that the fiction had turned out to be a real man who knew which concert she had laughed at and had sent her roses every month regardless. She said she thought she knew how she felt about it. She said she would require some time to be entirely sure, but she thought she knew. He had told her then the thing he had never said to anyone except me, that he had believed himself too closed, too heavy, too marked by the war to offer her anything worth having, that he had thought the best he could do was give without taking, sustain without burdening, that he had been, for 9 years, a man who had found the one thing that made the closed places in him feel less closed, and had then spent 9 years determining that he was not in a position to say so. She said, "You sent me roses every month for 9 years, and you did not think you had anything to offer." "When you put it like that," he told her, "it sounds less defensible than it seemed at the time." She said, apparently, that it did rather. And then she said, "I would very much like to be asked something, Your Grace, if you have something to ask." He asked, she answered. I was still in the corridor when they came out. She was ahead of him, and she looked composed and a little luminous in the way people look when something enormous has happened and they have not yet fully received it. He was behind her, and he looked, I want to find the right word. He looked present. After 9 years of watching a man be absent from his own life in the most deliberate and effortful way, he simply looked present in it. She saw me and stopped. She had known I was his closest friend. Ashmore had mentioned it when James asked to use the library. "Mr. Calloway," she said, "you knew." "I did," I said. "I'm sorry, he asked me not to tell." She considered this. "Were you," she paused, "were you the one who told him he was wrong to stay silent?" "Many times." "Good," she said. And then, with the absolute dignity that I had been hearing about for 9 years, "Thank you." She passed me and continued down the corridor toward the light of the supper room, where I could hear the company still milling, and James and I stood in the corridor with the candle between us. "Well," I said. "Well," he said. He looked at the corridor she had walked down. He looked at it for a long time. 9 years, I said, to that. To that, he said. He sounded, I am searching for it, and the word that comes is the simplest one. He sounded relieved. The long, bone-deep relief of someone who has been holding a weight for so long that they have forgotten it was extraordinary to hold it, and has set it down. They were engaged before the month was out. It was, as engagements go, not a complicated negotiation. There was no family on either side to be managed beyond her brother, who approved unreservedly, and his solicitor, who managed everything with the seamless efficiency of a man who had been managing this particular situation in its various forms for 9 years. James made certain that the arrangements made no reference to the previous anonymous assistants, which he wished to consider fully separate from what was now between them, a distinction she found both unnecessary and entirely like him. The wedding was a quiet one, as both of them preferred. I stood up with him, as I had been his closest friend for 18 years, and had perhaps earned the position by virtue of 9 years of keeping the secret and several years of telling him he was a coward. Cecily's younger brother walked her in, as the elder one was in London and could not get away until the evening. The ceremony was in the local church near Halverton, a small, cold stone church with good light and a vicar who kept things to the point, and she wore a gown of ivory satin and carried deep red roses. She carried deep red roses. I stood beside James at the front of the church, and I watched him see that, and I watched his face do the thing it had done in the Caldervane ballroom, the thing I had not seen before that night and had not stopped seeing since. The thing that was not coldness. I had seen the Duke of Halverton in many rooms over 18 years. I had seen him manage every variety of human situation with the impenetrable composure that was his great talent and his great armor. I had seen him negotiate. I had seen him angry. I had seen him in the field, in the years we served together, in circumstances that would have undone most men, and he had remained himself, contained, clear-eyed, unreachable. I had spent 9 years watching him sustain a love in total silence, with a discipline that would have exhausted a lesser man. And I had thought I knew, by now, every version of James Ashford that existed. I had not known this one. This was a man who had been found out, who had been loved back, which is a more disorienting thing by far than being refused, because you can prepare for refusal, and you cannot entirely prepare for the thing you most wanted arriving quietly at the church door in ivory satin carrying your roses. He was perfectly still at the front of that church, and his face was entirely open, which was not something James Ashford's face had been in my memory for at least 12 years. Afterward, at the small reception at Halverton House, I found myself standing with a glass of champagne near the drawing-room fireplace, watching them in the garden through the window. She was pointing at something in the winter border, and he was listening with the focused attention of a man for whom listening to this particular person is an activity of serious importance. And I thought about 9 years. I thought about the dinner in Wiltshire and the drive home, and the question asked in the tone men use when they are trying not to sound as though they are asking a question that matters. I thought about the roses. I thought about the library at Caldervane and the corridor outside it, and the way she had looked when she came out. I thought all of it led here. Even the years that looked like nothing were something. Even the silences were a form of speaking, or they were the preparation for speaking, or they were, in their flawed and too prolonged and fundamentally too cautious way, the truest thing he knew how to do at the time. I am not sure that is a full defense of 9 years of anonymity. I think it cost her something too. 9 years of praying for a fiction, 9 years of gratitude with no face to attach it to. A love should not require that one person sustain themselves on mystery, while the other keeps a careful distance and calls it virtue. But I have watched enough of life to believe that people arrive at their courage at the speed they arrive at it, and that some roads to a thing are longer than they should be, and you are still grateful to be on them. James Ashford was a man who had learned closed doors in a war, and had then spent 9 years expressing the only open thing left in him through the anonymity of roses and cleared debts, because that was the shape his love could take until it could take another. And when the shape changed, when he stood in that ballroom and the 9 years came to their crisis and he chose, at last, to be the author of something instead of its shadow, he was not too late. That is what I want to say. He was not too late. She came in from the garden a little while later, roses at her wrist, color in her face, looking like a woman who has been pointed to something particular in a winter border and found it interesting. She found me by the fire and stopped. "Mr. Calloway," she said. "Your Grace now," I said. She smiled. "I think, given everything, you may call me Cecily." "Given everything," I said. She looked toward the garden, where James was still standing, looking at whatever she had pointed at with the expression of a man who has been given a task and intends to complete it properly. "He is going to learn the names of all the roses," she said, with a warmth in it that was entirely her. "He has decided. He informed me of this decision this morning with quite extraordinary gravity, as though it were a matter of some strategic importance." "He approaches most things as matters of strategic importance," I said. I had noticed. She was quiet for a moment, watching him through the glass. "Mr. Calloway, Edmund, was it always?" She stopped. "I am trying to ask something, and I am not certain how to ask it." "He loved you from the dinner in Wiltshire," I said. "Before the debt, before the roses. He noticed you at a dinner table across a room, and he spent 9 years not knowing how to say so." She was quiet for a long moment. "9 years," she said softly. "9 years," I said. She looked at him in the garden. She looked at him for a long time, and I could not read everything that was in her face. It was too layered, too full of the particular interior work that a person does when they are revising a very large picture of their past, and discovering that something they thought was simply good fortune was, in fact, a person who had watched over them from a distance and found it insufficient, and had finally, in a candle-lit ballroom in front of 300 people, said so. "I think," she said at last, "I shall go and tell him that camellias do not tolerate frost, and that the ones at the east wall have been improperly covered." She paused, and there was the same small quality in her voice that I had seen from across the Caldervane ballroom, the brightness that was not quite composure. "And perhaps some other things." She went. I watched her cross to the garden door and open it and step out into the cold afternoon air, and I watched James turn at the sound of the door and look at her. The focused, entirely present look that was still new on him, still slightly surprising, as though he were still adjusting to the discovery that it was safe to look. And I finished my champagne by the fire in the drawing-room of Halverton House, and I thought of the cold study at Oxford, and 19 years old, and all the decades between then and now. And I did not feel at all like a fourth son of a Shropshire baronet with no fortune and no great title. I felt like a man who had been in the room for something true. He learned the names of all the roses. He told me so 6 months later, with the same extraordinary gravity he apparently applied to the decision. He learned every variety in the Halverton garden, and 1 or 2 in others that she considered particularly fine. He said that it seemed, given everything, to be the right thing to learn. I told him I thought he was right. He still sends her roses. Monthly, a fresh bunch. Not anonymous now, not from a florist in Bath, but cut from the Halverton garden by a gardener who has been given very specific instructions about which stems to select and how to arrange them. The card no longer says from a friend who wishes you well. It says nothing at all because it does not need to, because she knows his face now and he knows hers, and there are no more fictions to sustain and no more distances to maintain and no more reasons on earth for silence. I saw them last, both of them, at a county assembly in the early autumn. He was still not much of a dancer. She had apparently been working on this, and they danced one set together with the careful earnestness of 2 people who have agreed that a thing is worth doing, and are doing it with full attention if not quite with grace. He stood slightly too straight. She was patient with the rhythm. The room watched, as rooms always watched him, but with a different quality than before. The wariness was largely gone, replaced by something warmer, the collective recognition of a company that had been present at Caldervane and had not forgotten. I watched them and I thought, this is what 9 years comes to if it comes to anything. Not a grand public moment, though there had been that too, but 2 people dancing a little badly at a county assembly in early autumn, attentive to each other in the way of people who are still, after everything, in the early stages of knowing, still learning, still glad of it. I went home that evening feeling, as I often do now when I see them, that I have been in the room for something worth being in the room for. I have been his friend for 20 years. I have kept his secrets and told him he was a coward and stood beside him at the altar of a small cold church while she walked in carrying roses. I have been, I think, of some use. That is enough. It is in fact quite a lot. I still think so.